Welcome to the Search of Entrepreneurship and Regional Development podcast. Each publication in our journal is a great opportunity to share significant and audacious contributions to all our audience. My guest today is Klyver from the University of Southern Denmark and the University of Adelaide. He recently published an article entitled Preparedness Shapes Tomorrow: Crisis Preparedness and Strategies Among SMEs Amid External Crisis. He co-authored this paper with Suna Lover-Nielsen. It has been published in Entrepreneurship and Regional Development, a journal edited by Taylor and Francis. Kim, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
Can you tell us, what is the origin of your paper? Why have you decided to address this particular topic, and what is the question you aim to answer?
So I guess both Suna and I have always had an interest in highly uncertain context and particularly crisis. And we had already done stuff on crisis and entrepreneurship before the pandemic, particularly on the financial crisis. So it was a topic that interested us. And when the pandemic hit us, like we were all kind of like shocked by that pandemic, and I think a lot of people turned their research interest into like looking into the pandemic, and so did we. And I guess also had a personal kind of particular interest in crisis. Like, so just before the pandemic, I had a double lung transplantation, and of course, like before that, close to dying, and I was just kind of recovering as the pandemic came. So I had like a personal experience on how crisis impacts the way you think and how you behave. So that I think that personally increased my interest in looking into this phenomenon. And I think so. And I think for a long time, like business schools have been criticized for like doing stuff that doesn't matter to practice. Like we have a legitimacy crisis in many business schools, and I think Suna and I both talked about this. This might be a chance to do something that can be used straight away in businesses, because all the businesses were sitting there, had no clue what to do. So we also saw it as an opportunity to actually make some impact. And we applied for funding and got a larger project from the Danish Industrial Foundation. And we set up this project. So this paper is part of a bigger project. And essentially, the main purpose was to help businesses straight away. What should they do? And then it's only later on we have started to kind of use the data we collected to kind of publish more academic stuff. And so what we essentially, in another paper we established, in accordance with this other literature, that there's different crisis strategies, and some of them are efficient and others are not. And essentially, this literature shows, including our study, is that innovation strategies and trying to maintain your business is something that works, but retrenchment or reductions of your activities is normally a strategy that is dangerous. So in this paper, we were then trying to explain, can preparedness before the crisis explain which crisis strategies firms are taking when they're hit by a crisis?
What are the main contributions of your paper?
Yeah, the main contribution is that preparedness matters, right? I think that's the punchline, right? And as I said, like we know some crisis strategies are better than others. And essentially, I think what we are explaining, why are firms not always using the strategies that is known to work? Why are some companies actually using strategies that we basically know is not a good strategy? And that is because of preparedness. So essentially, SMEs cannot freely choose between the strategies they want. It depends on the preparedness. So that means, and I think what we're saying is it depends on their financial preparedness, like the cash, the liquidity they have when the crisis hit, because often initiatives cost money. It depends on the organizational preparedness. So are they flexible enough to adapt and react in a different manner to the changing environment? And do they have an entrepreneurial mindset, which we call cultural preparedness, to actually pursue or perceive the crisis as a chance for new opportunities and new innovations? So that's kind of the practical kind of answer to what's our contribution. And more theoretical, like we are integrating crisis management research on the pre-crisis preparedness with crisis management research on the crisis response. So we kind of like integrating what happens before the crisis with what happens during the crisis. And in that sense, we kind of study crisis management more as a process rather than something that happens at one point of time. And this includes both the before and after. Yeah.
What was for you the main theoretical or maybe methodological challenge or challenges in addressing such a question?
Well, apart from satisfying the reviewers, we had a lot of issues as well. So essentially we are so when the crisis hit, what most people do or did was they signed a new study collecting data. And that means they were collecting data after the crisis hit. Sometimes they ask about the historical things, but that means like everything that happened before was retrospectively measured. So that was kind of like a during design. What we were trying to do was a before during design. So that means we took our starting point in this data set we already collected back in 2015. It was a random sample of SMEs in Denmark. And then we kind of did a follow-up in 2020 after the pandemic hit. And in that way, we got a before and after design. But obviously, we did not predict the pandemic to arrive in 2020, back in 2015. So we obviously did not like design the study for this purpose. And therefore, some of the measures we use to measure crisis preparedness are not actually originally meant to measure crisis preparedness. So there is a kind of it was a challenge to justify the measurements related to the constructs. It was a balance between having a strong alignment between construct and measurements, but then with a retrospective design, and then what we did, maybe a weaker alignment between constructs and measurement, but then with the longitudinal design. But this was a challenging part. This was definitely the most challenging part, I think, yes.
During your research journey, what was your biggest surprise or the most counterintuitive result?
So I think the counterintuitive result is essentially that why do firms follow strategies that is known not to work, right? Like that is kind of a mystery, right? Why don't they just all innovate when we know innovation during a crisis is what produce good results? And essentially it's because they're not prepared yet, right? Either they don't have the liquidity to actually take initiatives, or they don't have the flexible organization to adapt, or they don't have the cultural mindset to actually see the crisis as an opportunity. So I think that was the most counterintuitive results. Empirically, I think we were hoping for, but also quite surprised about the support of our hypothesis, in the sense these are like it's long-term effects. So we measured preparedness in 2015, and like 5 years later, we measure the crisis strategies, and almost all our predictions actually work. So we get really long-lasting effects, almost like imprinting effect, you can say. And there's a lot of reasons why things should be blurred in those 5 years, other factors that should interrupt the effect we expect and make them disappear. But the fact that we find what we expect over such a long period of time only makes us believe even stronger in our results, I think. Yeah.
What are the main implications of your work for entrepreneurs, managers, policymakers, practitioners in general?
Yeah, I guess it's like prepare before the crisis hit. And it's obvious, but somehow it's also not really done. Like for instance, like it's not part of our paper, but there was other measures out there saying like most SMEs had so little liquidity that they could only survive a couple of months without a turnover, without sales. That makes them very, very vulnerable. And what we saw, like after the opening of the first lockdown, firms were more busy regaining the losses than actually preparing for next wave. So somehow, like preparing is just quickly out of the mindset of SMEs. And they often use the profit they make to grow more. So I think, and of course, they should not save everything for a crisis. They also need to invest in development and growth. But finding that balance, I think, is an important thing, right? So essentially, do we want to be competitive in normal times and grow faster than your competitors, but then being very vulnerable when a crisis hit? Or do you actually want to be like maybe less competitive during normal times, but then beat your competitors when the crisis hit because they have no cash to turn around? And that's a balance. But I think our results points to the fact that SMEs should be more focused on preparing and less on growing in normal times. Particularly since we know that crises are hitting more and more frequent at the moment. And then build an organization that stays flexible so SMEs can quickly adapt to the surroundings. And this is the challenge, right? Because when SMEs are growing, they need more procedures and formalities and structures. But this also makes them vulnerable and less able to actually react when the crisis hit. And then finally, build an entrepreneurial culture. If you build an entrepreneurial culture before the crisis hit, the organization, the employees, the management is more likely to pursue opportunities when the crisis hit. So I think that would be the advice for entrepreneurs.
Thanks a lot, Kim, for participating to our show and presenting your paper entitled Preparedness Shapes Tomorrow, Crisis Preparedness and Strategies Among SMEs Amid External Crises. All our podcasts are available on entrepreneurship-ed.com and on the main podcast platforms.